There is a specific moment that every narcissist dreads, and it has nothing to do with an argument, a confrontation, or being caught in a lie. It is quieter than that. It is the moment when the person they have spent months or years reading like an open book suddenly stops reacting the way they expect. No tears, no pleading, no anxious texts asking what went wrong, just stillness. And in that stillness, something in the narcissist begins to panic because for the first time, they cannot predict what happens next. If you have ever loved someone who seemed to know exactly which words would make you doubt yourself, exactly when to pull away to make you chase, exactly how to turn your own kindness into a leash, you already understand what this video is about. This is the story of what happens on the day an empath becomes impossible to read. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand not just the psychology behind it, but why that day is one of the most powerful turning points a person can experience. Let's start with how this dynamic usually begins, because it rarely starts with cruelty. It starts with attention. A narcissist does not walk into a relationship announcing their intentions. They walk in observing, watching how you respond to compliments, watching how quickly you forgive, watching what makes your face light up and what makes your shoulders drop. This isn't romance in the traditional sense. It's reconnaissance disguised as romance. And the tragedy is that most empaths mistake this intense observation for deep connection. They think, finally, someone who really sees me. In reality, they are being mapped. An empath by nature gives clear signals. They express hurt when they're hurt. They express joy when they're happy. They explain their feelings because they assume others want to understand them the way they try to understand others. This transparency, which is one of the most beautiful things about an empath, becomes the exact blueprint a narcissist uses to build control. Every emotional reaction becomes data. Every vulnerable conversation becomes a future pressure point. The empath isn't being paranoid by sensing this later. They are recognizing, often too late, that intimacy was never the goal. Predictability was. This is where the real psychological pattern begins to reveal itself. A narcissist doesn't need you to love them. They need you to be readable, because a readable person is a controllable person. If they know that silence makes you anxious, they'll use silence. If they know that praise makes you soften, they'll ration it like a reward you have to earn. If they know guilt makes you overcompensate, they'll manufacture situations where you feel like you owe them something. None of this requires genius. It only requires attention, and narcissists are remarkably attentive to the one thing that benefits them: your emotional patterns. Here's the part most people never talk about, though. This system only works as long as the empath's reactions stay consistent. The entire structure of manipulation depends on cause and effect remaining stable. They do this, you respond that way, they get what they want. So what happens when the pattern breaks? What happens when the empath, exhausted from years of being predictable, starts changing internally in ways the narcissist cannot see coming? That's the day everything shifts. It doesn't happen with an argument. It doesn't happen with a dramatic exit. It usually happens in silence inside the empath's own mind long before it becomes visible on the outside. It might start with a small thought. Why do I always apologize first? Or a subtle realization. I explained myself again and nothing changed. Or the most dangerous thought of all, dangerous for the narcissist, that is, I don't think this is actually about me. Once that thought lands, something begins to change in how the empath processes the relationship. They start noticing the pattern instead of just feeling the pain. And noticing the pattern is the beginning of becoming unreadable, because pain is reactive, but pattern recognition is observational. The empath moves from being inside the emotional storm to standing slightly outside of it, watching how it forms. This shift is subtle, but it is seismic. Think about what this means for the narcissist. Their entire method of control relies on the empath staying emotionally reactive. The moment the empath becomes observational instead of reactive, the narcissist loses their primary tool. They can still say the same words. They can still create the same situations. But the response they're used to getting, the immediate emotional collapse, the immediate need to fix things, the immediate self-blame, doesn't arrive the same way anymore. And a narcissist without a predictable reaction is like a musician playing an instrument that no longer makes sound. They keep pressing the keys, but nothing happens the way it used to. This is usually when things escalate because narcissists don't respond well to losing predictability. If subtle manipulation stops working, they often intensify it, testing to see if bigger tactics will produce the old reaction. This might look like sudden affection after a long stretch of coldness. It might look like accusing the empath of changing, of becoming cold, of not caring anymore. An accusation that is almost always a projection of what the narcissist is actually afraid of losing. It might look like bringing up old vulnerabilities, hoping to reopen a wound that used to guarantee a certain response. And here is something rarely discussed. The escalation itself is proof that the pattern is breaking. Narcissists don't escalate when things are working. They escalate when control is slipping. So if you have ever experienced someone becoming more intense, more accusatory, or more emotionally manipulative right after you started setting boundaries or pulling back your emotional availability, that intensity wasn't a sign you were doing something wrong. It was a sign you were doing something right. You became harder to read, and that terrified them. But let's slow down here, because this transformation inside the empath doesn't happen overnight. And it's not driven by anger, even though anger might be part of it. It's driven by something deeper, exhaustion converting into clarity. Most empaths don't wake up one day and decide to become strategic. They arrive there because they have simply run out of the emotional resources required to keep reacting the old way. And in that depletion, something unexpected happens. Instead of collapsing, they start observing. Instead of asking, "What did I do wrong?" they start asking, "Why does this keep happening the same way, no matter what I do?" That single question is the seed of everything that follows. Once an empath begins asking that question sincerely, without immediately blaming themselves for asking it, they start to see the architecture behind the behavior instead of just the behavior itself. They start noticing that apologies from the narcissist tend to appear right when the empath is close to leaving. They start noticing that affection increases right after distance is created, but rarely as a genuine gesture, more like a strategic pull timed almost perfectly to interrupt the empath's clarity. They start noticing that conversations about their feelings somehow always end with the narcissist's feelings taking center stage. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition finally catching up to lived experience. And once an empath sees the pattern clearly, even once, they can never fully unsee it again. It becomes background knowledge, quietly reshaping every future interaction, even in moments when the empath isn't consciously thinking about it. This is the beginning of becoming unreadable, not through coldness, not through revenge, not through calculated games of their own, but through the simple, profound shift of no longer mistaking a manipulative pattern for a personal failure. And once that shift begins, nothing about the relationship can stay the same, because the entire dynamic was built on the empath not seeing what we are about to explore next. The deeper mechanics of exactly how this manipulation operates beneath the surface, why it works so effectively on emotionally attuned people specifically, and what subtle psychological signals most empaths overlook until it's almost too late. To understand why this pattern works so effectively on empaths specifically, we need to look at something most people misunderstand about emotional sensitivity. It is often treated as a weakness, a liability, the reason someone let themselves be manipulated. But that framing misses the real mechanism entirely. Empaths aren't targeted because they're weak. They're targeted because they're generous with something narcissists cannot generate on their own: emotional depth. A narcissist doesn't have an abundant internal well of empathy, patience, or emotional nuance. What they have is the ability to recognize where those qualities exist in someone else and slowly redirect that resource toward themselves. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly. A narcissist isn't simply selfish in the way we casually use that word. Their sense of self is unstable, often built on a foundation that requires constant external validation just to feel real. Underneath the confidence, the charm, the certainty they project, there is frequently a fragile core that cannot tolerate criticism, cannot sit with shame, and cannot regulate its own emotional state without outsourcing that job to someone else. And who better to outsource it to than an empath, someone biologically and emotionally wired to absorb, soothe, and stabilize the people around them. This is why empaths so often report the same confusing sensation in these relationships, the feeling of being needed intensely, yet somehow never truly known. The narcissist leans on the empath's emotional labor constantly for comfort, for reassurance, for validation, for someone to manage their moods, but rarely reciprocates that same attentiveness. The relationship becomes lopsided in a way that's difficult to name at first because it doesn't look like neglect. It looks like closeness. It looks like dependency, which many people mistake for love. But dependency and love are not the same thing. One asks, "How can I support you?" And the other asks, "How can you keep supporting me?" Now let's talk about something rarely discussed in mainstream conversations about narcissism: the role of intermittent reinforcement and why it is so much more powerful than constant mistreatment would ever be. If a narcissist were cruel all the time, the empath would leave quickly. Consistent negativity is actually easy to recognize and painful enough to motivate an exit. What keeps empaths locked in for years isn't consistent cruelty. It's unpredictability layered with unforgettable moments of genuine seeming connection. Picture it like this. There are stretches of coldness, criticism, or emotional withdrawal. Then, just as the empath starts to gain clarity, starts to consider stepping back, the narcissist offers a moment of warmth so vivid, so seemingly sincere, that it eclipses everything difficult that came before it. A long-awaited apology, a rare, tender conversation, a gesture that feels like proof the real version of this person still exists underneath the difficulty. This is what psychologists refer to as intermittent reinforcement, and it's the same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive. Unpredictable rewards create stronger emotional attachment than consistent ones, because the brain starts chasing the next moment of connection the way it chases any variable reward. The empath isn't staying because they're naive. They're staying because their nervous system has been conditioned to associate uncertainty with hope. This explains something many empaths feel guilty about but rarely say out loud: missing someone who hurt them. That confusion isn't a character flaw. It's the direct result of a conditioning pattern that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with how intermittent reward systems affect attachment. Understanding this mechanism is often the first real crack in the empath's self-blame, because it reframes the situation from "I was foolish for staying" to "I was responding exactly the way any human nervous system would respond to this specific pattern." Now, let's go deeper into the subtle behaviors that most people overlook entirely, because narcissistic manipulation rarely looks dramatic in the moment. It looks like small, almost invisible shifts in conversation. One of the most common and least discussed patterns is what we might call emotional redirection. The empath brings up something that hurt them. Instead of addressing it, the narcissist redirects the conversation toward their own feelings: how exhausting it is to be accused, how nobody appreciates what they do, how hurtful it is that the empath would even bring this up. Within minutes, the empath is comforting the very person who hurt them, and the original issue is never resolved. It simply evaporates under the weight of someone else's performed hurt. Another subtle pattern is strategic ambiguity. Narcissists often avoid direct answers, not because they lack the ability to communicate clearly, but because ambiguity keeps the empath working harder to interpret their intentions. If a person never quite says what they mean, the empath fills in the blanks, usually with generosity, usually assuming the best. This constant interpretive labor keeps the empath mentally occupied with the relationship far more than a straightforward partner ever would. and busy minds rarely have the space to step back and see the larger pattern. There's also a quieter form of manipulation involving comparison, not always dramatic comparisons to other people, but comparisons to the narcissist's own idealized version of the relationship. Statements like, "You used to be so much more understanding," or "I thought you were different from everyone else," plant a specific kind of doubt. They suggest that the empath is failing to live up to some earlier, better version of themselves, when in reality, the empath hasn't changed. Their tolerance has simply reached its limit, and the narcissist is using nostalgia as a tool to pull them back into old patterns of self-sacrifice. Here's where it gets even more interesting, though, because this is the part that explains why the day an empath becomes unreadable is so disorienting for the narcissist. All of these tactics, redirection, ambiguity, nostalgia, intermittent warmth, depend entirely on the empath processing information emotionally in real time. The narcissist is essentially playing a game that requires the other player to respond quickly, instinctively, and from the heart. The moment the empath starts processing the same information analytically instead of emotionally, the entire game changes shape, even though the narcissist is still using the same old moves. This is why so many empaths describe a strange sensation once they start recognizing the pattern. The words the narcissist says stop landing the way they used to, not because the empath has become numb or cold, but because they've started asking a different internal question. Instead of, "How do I fix this?" they start asking, "Why does this keep happening in exactly the same shape?" That single shift in questioning changes everything because it moves the empath from participant to observer, and an observer cannot be manipulated the same way a participant can. There's another layer here worth naming clearly, because it's rarely spoken about with honesty. Narcissists often sense this shift before they can consciously articulate it. They may not have the language for, "My partner has started recognizing my patterns," but they feel the absence of their usual influence almost immediately. This is often what triggers the escalation we talked about earlier, the sudden accusations of coldness, the sudden intensity, the sudden effort to reopen old emotional wounds. It isn't random, it's an unconscious attempt to restore a dynamic that is quietly slipping away. And this is precisely why the moment an empath becomes hard to read is so significant. It isn't about revenge, and it isn't about becoming someone else. It's about the internal architecture of the relationship losing its foundation. The narcissist was never in a relationship with a static person. They were in a relationship with a set of predictable emotional responses. Once those responses evolve, once the empath starts responding from clarity instead of conditioning, the narcissist isn't losing a partner in the way they understand loss. They're losing a mirror that used to reflect exactly what they needed to see. This is the turning point we need to sit with next, because understanding how this shift happens internally and what specifically changes in the empath's mind, body, and self-perception once they stop being predictable reveals the most important insight of this entire story, what it actually means to become unreadable, and why that transformation, more than any goodbye or confrontation, is the real ending to this pattern. Let's talk about what actually happens inside an empath when this shift takes root, because it isn't a personality change, and it isn't emotional shutdown, even though from the outside it can look that way to someone who's used to a different version of you. What's really happening is a recalibration of where meaning gets assigned. For most of the relationship, the empath assigned meaning to the narcissist's behavior based on intention. They said this because they care. They did that because they're hurting. They pulled away because something is wrong and I should help. Once the pattern becomes visible, meaning starts getting assigned based on function instead. Not what does this mean, but what does this do? What effect does this behavior have? Who benefits from me reacting the way I always react? This single change from interpreting intention to observing function is the actual mechanism behind becoming unreadable. It has nothing to do with becoming distant or guarded in a defensive sense. It has everything to do with no longer outsourcing your emotional interpretation, to someone who has a vested interest in you interpreting things a certain way. And once an empath starts running their own interpretation instead of accepting the narcissist's version of events, something remarkable happens to their nervous system. The chronic anxiety that used to accompany every ambiguous text, every mood shift, every unpredictable silence starts to quiet down. Not because the narcissist changed, because the empath stopped needing an explanation before they could feel steady. This is worth sitting with because it overturns something most people assume about healing from these dynamics. We tend to think clarity comes after distance, that you have to leave first, and then understanding follows. But for most empaths, it happens in reverse. Understanding comes first, quietly, internally, often while they're still standing inside the relationship. And that understanding is what eventually makes distance possible, whether that distance is physical, emotional, or simply a shift in how much of themselves they're willing to keep offering. Now, here is the deepest part of this pattern, the part that explains why this entire dynamic exists in the first place and why it so often involves specifically empathic people. Narcissistic behavior, at its core, is not really about the empath at all. It never was. It's an attempt to manage an internal experience of inadequacy that the narcissist cannot tolerate feeling directly. Every manipulation tactic, every redirection, every accusation, every sudden withdrawal of affection is a strategy to avoid sitting with an unbearable internal question. What if I am not enough on my own? The empath becomes the emotional labor system that prevents the narcissist from ever having to face that question directly. Because as long as someone else is managing the emotional atmosphere, the narcissist never has to. This reframing changes everything for the person healing from it because it removes the empath from the center of the story where they never actually belonged. So much of the pain in these relationships comes from a mistaken belief. If I had loved better, understood more, given more patience, this person would have treated me differently. But the truth is heavier and ultimately more freeing. The treatment was never a measurement of the empath's worth or effort. It was a reflection of an internal deficit that existed long before the empath arrived and would have continued long after they left, redirected toward whoever stepped into that role next. This is usually the insight that changes an empath permanently, and it's worth explaining clearly because it's rarely stated this directly. You cannot love someone into feeling secure in themselves if their instability is the mechanism keeping the relationship running. In many of these dynamics, the empath's growing understanding, patience, and emotional generosity don't heal the narcissist. They inadvertently stabilize the very pattern that needs to stay unresolved for the dynamic to continue. This isn't a failure on the empath's part. It's simply outside the scope of what one person's love can repair in another person who isn't engaging with their own patterns honestly. So what changes once the empath fully understands this? Several things, and they tend to happen roughly in this order, though not always neatly. First, self-blame starts to lose its grip. Once you understand that predictability, not affection, was the actual currency being extracted from you, the question shifts from what's wrong with me to what was this relationship actually built to do. That shift alone relieves a weight that many empaths have carried for years, sometimes across multiple relationships, without ever naming it clearly. Second, empathy stops being something the empath gives away automatically and starts becoming something they offer selectively with awareness. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of healing from this dynamic. Becoming unreadable doesn't mean becoming less empathic. It means empathy stops being a reflex that anyone can trigger and starts being a resource the empath consciously directs toward people who reciprocate it. The capacity for depth doesn't disappear. It simply stops being available on demand to anyone who knows which emotional buttons to press. Third, and this is the part that often surprises people the most, the empath's relationship with silence changes completely. Early in these dynamics, silence from the narcissist usually creates panic. What did I do? Why are they upset? How do I fix this? But once someone truly understands the pattern, Silence stops being a threat and starts being information. If someone withdraws to manipulate rather than to genuinely process, that withdrawal no longer pulls the same emotional trigger it used to. The empath can sit in that silence without their old compulsion to chase, explain, or repair something that was never actually broken by them in the first place. And this brings us to the moment we opened with: the day an empath becomes impossible to read. Now you understand what that day actually is. It isn't a performance of coldness. It isn't strategy borrowed from the narcissist's own playbook. It's the natural result of someone finally interpreting reality through their own eyes instead of through a lens someone else designed for them. The narcissist doesn't lose control because the empath fought back. They lose control because the empath stopped needing to be understood by them in order to understand themselves. This is why that moment feels so disorienting to a narcissist, and why it often produces exactly the escalation we talked about earlier: the sudden accusations, the sudden warmth, the sudden urgency to reopen old wounds. None of that is a sign of power. It's a sign of someone realizing, often for the first time, that their usual instruments no longer produce the same music. And it's worth saying plainly, that reaction is not something the empath needs to fix, soften, or manage. It's simply confirmation that the old system has stopped functioning, which is exactly what needed to happen. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own story in it, I want to be honest with you about something important. This kind of clarity doesn't usually arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrives gradually, often quietly, sometimes so subtly that you don't notice the shift until you look back and realize you handled something completely differently than you would have a year ago. You didn't explain yourself as much. You didn't chase an explanation for behavior that never made sense. You noticed a pattern instead of absorbing a feeling. That's not coldness. That's the return of your own perspective, which was never actually gone, only buried under the exhausting labor of trying to make sense of someone who was never being fully honest with you in the first place. The most important thing to understand walking away from this is that becoming unreadable was never about protecting yourself from someone else. It was about returning to yourself. Every empath who has lived through this kind of relationship carries an enormous capacity for depth, loyalty, and understanding. Qualities that were never the problem, no matter how many times that message was implied. The problem was never your sensitivity. It was the direction that sensitivity was pointed in, towards someone who used it as a resource instead of receiving it as a gift. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from everything we've explored today, let it be this: clarity is not the opposite of empathy. Clarity is what allows empathy to finally be placed where it belongs, with people who meet it honestly, who don't require you to be predictable in order to feel safe, and who don't mistake your depth for something to manage. The day you become hard to read isn't the day you stop feeling. It's the day you stop performing feelings for someone who was never really watching you at all. It's the day you finally become the one person in the room who understands exactly what's happening. And once you reach that day, you don't go back to who you were before it. You simply move forward, finally, as yourself.